Good morning, good day. We will wait for another minute and we will go live. Thank you for joining us. So I think we shall start. Good day to everyone who is joining us today. We have gathered here today on the International Day for the of the world's Indigenous people. I'm Shruti Ajit. I'm the Program Officer for Women for Biodiversity. So before we go through the actual session, I'm going to go through some ground rules that will ensure the smooth running of the session. So if we could go to the next slide, Susanna. Yes, thank you so much. So we are requesting everyone to change their username to your name and the organization. We would be, after the panel is done, we would be having a Q&A session. So for anyone who wants to ask your questions can do so in the chat box and we will be moderating it there. Please indicate your country, the organization, or where you work. And please also mention who you want the question to be addressed or which speaker you want the question to be addressed to. Now, while we have English is the mode of communication right now, and all the entire session will be done in English. But in case if we need any interpretation, especially in Spanish, please do let us know in the chat box, and we will try and incorporate the translation if it's needed. So, while we've done the basics, we can jump straight into the actual session. To begin with, I would like if you could let us know what are the various little things that you've inherited, knowledge that you've inherited from your mother or your grandmother. Like it could be a food recipe, something, a recipe for a cold that you use at home. So, what are those knowledge systems that each of you have uh, got from your mothers or your grandmothers? And to start with, we could have the responses in the chat box. And if anyone would also like to share, please do so even in the, you can raise your hand and we can have one or two people who may want to share something that they've got from their mother or their grandmothers or even great grandmothers. So my question is, though for the participants who are here, what are the various little knowledge things, knowledge kind of which was transferred from your mother or your grandmother to you, and that you still practice today? What are those? Please feel free to put it in the chat box or raise your hand to share with all of us if you feel comfortable. Is there anyone? We've got one response. Uh, Local medicine that can treat cough, that's great. Seed preservation, propagation of and medicinal herbs. Lot of turmeric as antibiotics to cure cold. And this is exactly some of the examples of knowledge systems that we will be talking about, and things that are very important, but also so ingrained in all of us, but we never think of it as something very important for biodiversity as well. Thank you for all who have responded on the comments. I think we can move on to the next segment because we have a very interesting panel right now. And when we think of, like what I was saying, when we think of conservation, we always assume we need to separate man from nature. But however, for centuries, indigenous people and local communities have been practicing, governing, and managing their biodiversity through their knowledge systems, traditional knowledge systems, which has evolved with time and has been passed from one generation to the next through sustainable use and access to the natural resources. Women's knowledge systems are also linked to food security, the health of the community, the animals, and the biodiversity around them, like so many examples that we are seeing, and as well as their livelihood. However, with rampant and meaningless development, biodiversity loss, climate change, amongst many, many factors, these knowledge systems are slowly vanishing. And it's also taking with it the history, the culture, and the languages sometimes also, which are intricately intertwined with these knowledge systems. So it is time that we recognize these threats and address them. And today, with the theme of on International Day for World Indigenous People being the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge, we have with us this wonderful panel who will give us a valuable insights on the same. Starting off with the keynote speakers, we have Mrinalini Rai and a video message from Hanie Mogani. Mrinalini Rai is the Director for Women for Biodiversity, and she's an international expert on biodiversity and gender and has worked several years in advocating for the rights of Indigenous people and local communities and women and youth in various and local global dialogues. She is also part of the Women Caucus of the UNCBD, and she's been promoting the rights of women, especially in terms of tenurial rights, use and access of sustainable use and access, and participation of women in various spaces. So, without further ado, I'm going to let Mrinalini Rai take over. Over to you, Mrinalini.
Thank you, Shruti, and a warm welcome. And happy World's Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a very special event today. So once again, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us from different time zones, from different places. And this is really very important to see this coming together of all of us together. So warm welcome to all of you who have taken the time to join us to commemorate and celebrate today, August 9th, International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. On 23rd December 1994, the United Nations General Assembly decided in its resolution 49/214 that the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples shall be observed on 9th August every year. The date marks the first meeting in 1982 of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations. This year's theme is very close to heart because this is the role of Indigenous women in the preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge. According to a report of ILO, globally, there are an estimated 476.6 million Indigenous peoples, of whom 238.4 million are women and 238.2 million are men. Overall, they represent 6.2% of the world's population. As my colleagues have also shared, Indigenous women cover every geographic region in the world, from the lands to the seas. They represent diverse and rich knowledge, history, and skills that sustain the well-being of Indigenous communities. They are the transmitters of intergenerational knowledge, retaining their roles as stewards of the lands and knowledge bearers of food and medicine. Their knowledge and practices help address the global crisis of climate change, conservation of biological diversity, and building resilience amid the COVID pandemic. Despite their contributions, however, the roles and contributions of women is still seen in many cases as vulnerable or as beneficiaries, where they should be recognized as partners and as agents of change. However, there is a growing recognition of Indigenous women's roles in decision-making processes at some levels, but more needs to be done. So aspirations, acknowledgements, recognitions need to be put into actions. So there is advancement on the recognition, on the contributions of women. I'll share some of the, I think some of the very crucial advancements that have also been taking place, including this year or in the process. So the Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples will devote his next thematic report to Indigenous women and the development, application, preservation, and transmission of scientific knowledge to be presented to the Human Rights Council at its 51st session this year in September 2022. The report will focus on the roles of Indigenous women as scientific and technical knowledge keepers in the context of international human rights law and identify current threats and challenges that Indigenous women face both internally and externally for being women and Indigenous. You also have the CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, who is currently elaborating a general recommendation on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. This general recommendation, number 39, will be the first binding instrument focused on the rights of Indigenous women and girls and responds to a long-standing demand by Indigenous women themselves for a specific instrument to promote and protect their rights. Recently, also in May, at the UNCCD COP15 in Cote d'Ivoire, in the Abidjan Declaration on Advancing Gender Equality for Successful Land Restoration, recognized that securing women's access to land and control over land and access to finance for land-based economic activities are central components of women's economic empowerment and women's rights, generating opportunities for economic prosperity and autonomy. Also, recently, in the landmark move on 28 July, the United Nations General Assembly recognize that a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment is a universal human right. The Convention on Biological Diversity, in its preamble, recognizes the vital role that women play in the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and affirms the need for the full participation of women at all levels of policy making and implementation for biological diversity conservation. Also, a specific framework for the participation of Indigenous women is found in the program of work, which is task 4 on the implementation of Article 8J, which is also in the CBD convention, also known as an article on traditional knowledge. And recently, not the least, is an important outcome at the UNCBD's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework open-ended working group in June in Nairobi, which now has a standalone target on gender equality, which we all refer to as Target 22. So there is all this work going on. What's really needed for us is to kind of come together and find these synergies and see where the focus is. And this is also showcasing that Indigenous women are agents of change. So enabling Indigenous women's rights and gender equality in all aspects should help catalyze an urgent transmission to more resilient, inclusive, gender-responsive models of sustainable development while upholding justice and human rights. So in ending, please do stay with us. This International Day of Indigenous Peoples, today where we have gathered, is to come together in the celebration, highlighting the role of Indigenous women and the importance of preserving their rights, communities, and knowledge they gathered and passed down over centuries. So let's keep reclaiming her space. Thank you so much, Shruti.
Thank you, Tina, for such a inspiring opening note. We now have a video message from Hanie Mugani. Hanie is a member of the UN Permanent Forum and is actively involved in more than 20 national and international projects with indigenous nomadic pastoralists and local communities of Iran to advocate their rights over their territories of life and natural resources and co-management of natural resources and recognition of the indigenous and community conserved areas and territories, the ICCAs, and sustainable livelihood. So, can we have the video message now? Susanna, we cannot hear the audio. Just quick. So while we fix the technical issue, maybe we can jump into the panel right now, as right away, the panel discussion. So before we have the discussion, it's my honor to introduce the panelists to you. So, with us, we have Pragya Rai from Nepal, who is the Indigenous Women Program Coordinator of Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, AIPP. She's been a gender specialist with more than 10 years of direct work experience in gender and development programming in the Asia region, including supporting organizations to mainstream gender equality and social inclusions in their strategies. Along with her, we have Gertrude Kabusimbi Kenyagi. I'm apologizing if I've got the name wrong. Who is based in Uganda, and she's the director of the Support for Women in Agriculture and Environment, SWAGIL, who has had a 20 years of work experience in forest and biodiversity conservation right on the grassroots in Uganda. She's been involved in discourses surrounding the CBD since its inception, bringing a gender dimension and advocating for framing the CBD in its scientific as well as social identity. She is a member of the Women and Gender Constituency of the UNFCCC, and she is also the member of Women's Major Group in the UN. She is also the observer for Africa in the Climate Investment Funds, the Forest Investment. So, Gertrude, we have you and Pragya. Thank you for joining us. So, we can quickly jump into the first question. Um, uh, just to quickly, Pragya, you can hear me, right? Yes, Tina?
Yeah, sorry. I think I have Hani's video. Would you want me to just run that? I can do that from my screen.
Sure.
Okay.
Pragya and Gertrude, maybe 4 minutes, and then we can jump back into this. Sure.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
With the
Yes,
video?
yes. Yes.
Can you hear the
members across the world a very happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
I'm sorry, Shruti, can you give me a heads up? Can you hear the video if I'm playing it?
Yes, we can, but it's very faint.
Yeah, the 1 second is a bit faint, so sorry. Let me just.
I would like to wish Indigenous community members across the world a very happy Indigenous Peoples Day. The preservation and transmission of traditional knowledge is a theme of this year's commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. It is an opportunity to celebrate Indigenous women's rich knowledge about the natural world, health, technologies, and other significant cultural expressions. Generation after generation, women pass on this traditional knowledge, which is a precious inheritance. Indigenous women are the backbone of Indigenous peoples' communities and play a crucial role in the preservation and transmission of traditional ancestral knowledge. They have an integral collective and community role as carriers of natural resources and keepers of scientific knowledge. Many Indigenous women are also taking the lead in the defense of lands and territories and advocating for Indigenous peoples' collective rights worldwide. Indigenous women play a vital role as holders of scientific and technical knowledge related to medicines and foods, conservation and the preservation of language, culture, and generational histories. While recognizing and not diminishing the contributions of men in developing and perpetuating knowledge, so many studies are necessary to highlight the unique challenges faced by Indigenous women in retaining and revitalizing their role as knowledge keepers. According to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, all the rights and freedoms are equally granted to male and female Indigenous individuals. The rights of Indigenous women are recognized especially under Articles 21, 22, and 44 of the UNDRIP. Therefore, the rights of Indigenous women are guaranteed under the Declaration. There are also scientific rights to traditional knowledge and access to resources that are recognized by the UNDRIP. In traditional societies, women held the main responsibility of educating their children to take on adult roles. As Indigenous peoples, we have the right to ensure the continuity of our practices, customs, and traditions. So, women must bring back to this role so that our spiritual and cultural knowledge does not disappear and it's transmitted to the next generations. UN Women recognizes the potential of the traditional knowledge held by Indigenous women to eradicate poverty, enhance sustainable development, food security, and biodiversity. We are committed to work with Indigenous and local communities, in particular with women from around the world, to ensure that our rights, voices, and experiences are protected and amplified. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina, for sharing that with us. So, can we also have Pragya and Gertrude on the screen? So, my first question for Pragya and Gertrude are: what are the ways in which Indigenous women and their traditional knowledge and practices contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity and natural resources? Are there any challenges and threats to these practices? How have these knowledge systems withstood the changing times? So, could we have Pragya first to talk about this?
Yeah, hi, Shruti. Thanks for the lovely introduction. And in addition, also like to share that I'm also an Indigenous woman from Rai community of Nepal. Thank you for having me here, Tinadi and the team. Before going to the question, Shruti, I'd like to share a story, and this is how the most traditional knowledges are transmitted from Indigenous women. And storytelling is one of the most significant way how they do it. So to everyone present here, I'd like to share the story of the Indigenous women in Thailand who use their forests as a space for knowledge preservation and transmission. Shruti, you can see the screen, right? Okay. So this is the story about the current indigenous communities in the village of Hoi Ikam, which is in Thailand, northern Thailand. And in this community, it is believed that when a baby is born, all life begins in the forest. So what they do is when a baby is born, their umbilical cord is placed in a bamboo container and hung on a healthy fruit tree like this. So they have dedicated big space of trees like the forest area to hang these umbilical cords. This way, they believe that the souls of the baby and tree are intertwined throughout their lifespan, and nobody is allowed to cut the tree, and nobody's even people don't even make it dirty. It's kept clean and very healthy. So this is how the belief was explained by the village chief Noiri. Noiri is 47 years old and she's the first woman to head the village and only female leader in the whole district of Mewang located in Chiang Mai. She's also a Karen indigenous person. So according to Noiri, the forest is their community supermarket. They use this forest to find food and medicines, and they also know how to collect and preserve them. She says, without us women, the forest cannot be maintained. And Noiri calls it a community supermarket. And in 2016, Noiri initiated a women's forest to create a space for indigenous knowledge transmission, food production, and supplementary income generation. This forest is used also as natural forest classroom, and it is in an area of 9.6 hectares, where variety of indigenous trees, plants, species are planted and also used for herbal medicine, cloth dyeing, food production, etc. Here, community members, and especially young girls, can acquire knowledge and skills in natural resource management, usually held by indigenous women. The 60% of community land in Hoyekam is considered a protected area, which only allows for harvest of non-timber forest products. And the remaining 40% is residential areas, designated zones for crop farming, rotational crop farming, as well as community forestry. And they have this beautiful traditional textiles and patterns, which is mostly made up of the natural dyeing process and natural fibers, etc. According to Noiri, trees have souls like humans. Most of the indigenous communities, we believe that we humans are just one element, nature, and we are deeply connected with forest on a spiritual level. And according to Ferenc, everything is in nature, such as water, forest, and fire, has spirit. And before engaging in any agriculture activity, they need to be consulted and we need to seek their permission. So this is how the villagers seek the permission from the nature and the spirits and the ancestors before performing any agriculture activity. This was mainly, this was done before releasing the fish to the stream. So I'll share the link of the story here, but I won't go much into details. But Noiri also says something like, mindsets take time to shift. Even in matrilineal indigenous communities like the Karens, it is the men who are usually granted roles as leaders and representatives of their communities, and who are expected to provide the main source of family income. And she says it does take time for mindset to shift. And in our culture, female leadership is usually seen as a bad thing. Women cannot be leaders. If a woman becomes a leader, our people believe that bad things will happen, and then there will be no rainfall or the harvest will turn out poorly. But since 2019, Noiri has proven the village wrong. However, men are still doubting her capacities, but she believes it is getting better. And they have learned to respect her as the village chief. And she says, after all, I have been elected by my people, and I refuse taking on role of serving and pleasing that is usually assigned to women in our culture. I want to inspire other indigenous women and show them that we are. I'll stop sharing the story here now, and going back to your question, Shruti. As you could see in the story as well, women, indigenous women are preservers, and they are also the knowledge holders. And the knowledge they have is based on the accumulated observations of local phenomena. And it is often held in oral than written forms. And the most significant thing about the indigenous women holding these knowledge and preserving is the knowledge they have is more holistic rather than specialists. And indigenous women have been maintaining and transmitting knowledge not only to their own children but to the younger generation and communities. Not only the knowledge but also their values and beliefs that we live in harmony with the nature. So, and there are other concepts, like, for example, in Malaysia also, there's this concept called Gompi Kuno, where the indigenous peoples, in particular indigenous women, they leave the land after harvesting for a certain number of years. And the objective is to let the land regenerate. And that's proven, that has proven to be one of the most sustainable ways of agricultural farming, etc. So this is how some of the ways that indigenous women and their traditional knowledge are contributing to the sustainable use of biodiversity and natural resources. And talking about the challenges, today we have published our statement on Indigenous Peoples Day, which also reads, "Our lands and territories are the spaces where our freedom sprang from, and our spirituality and worldviews are closely tied to it. And our very capacity and need to contribute to the national and global issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, food and nutrition, etc., depends on securing and protecting our rights to lands, territories, and resources." So most of the things are, of course, our connection, based on our connection to the land, territories, and resources. So the challenges we are facing right now are many, but to name a few, I would say development aggression, which is displacing the indigenous peoples from their ancestral land and depriving indigenous people, especially indigenous women, to practice their traditional knowledge and skill, which is also contributing to increased violence against indigenous women, which we can mostly see in Bangladesh, mostly in the Chittagong Hill tracts. And there's another challenge that our indigenous sisters are facing, which are the repressive states. For example, our indigenous sisters from Northeast India, they are still fighting with the state to claim their intellectual property rights on their traditional patterns of living. And we can see clearly from our sisters in Philippines and Cambodia how the indigenous women human rights defenders are facing the trumped up charges when they are trying to protect their ancestral lands, which have all been worsened by the pandemics. Yeah, Shruti. So I think these are the challenges that our sisters are facing. Can you repeat the second question?
Yes, we were also wondering because we said that traditional knowledge systems and indigenous knowledge systems are also not something which are static. They are dynamic, they change over time. And so, how have these knowledge systems withstood with the changing times, with the threats that are there?
I think it's only possible due to this strong commitment and strong desire from the indigenous peoples and the indigenous peoples movement that these knowledges, practices, and skills that have evolved and also withstood all of these challenges. But it still has a long way to go because we're still fighting for our spaces. We're still fighting for our voices to be heard, which Tinadi already said. It is gaining traction a little bit right now, but of course, there's a long way to go, Shruti.
Thank you, Pragya. That was really, thank you for sharing that case study and whatever. That was so powerful. And it resonates a lot with so many of the struggles that's going around globally with the indigenous people and local community struggles. Um, so with that, we also have Gertrude, who would be also addressing the same question. So Gertrude, over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation and happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Yeah, much of what I wanted to say was contained in the presentation by the previous panelist, but I also want to emphasize that Indigenous women have the knowledge and ability to identify different species of flora and fauna. It's important because if we lose the names of these species and their special characteristics, then we have lost everything. And they also know their uses. They pass it from generation to generation. For instance, they know that this is good for this food. Before there was any science to balance the nutrition, for nutritional balance, we already had nutritional balance within our indigenous communities. That's how our children survived. And then they also have the knowledge that this is medicine and it cures such and such. And this knowledge is passed. I'm going to request you that I turn on my video because my internet becomes disrupted. At least you've seen that I'm on. Okay, thank you. Anyway, so the food, they're able to identify the uses accurately and pass them on. It's the passing on from generation to generation that's also important, so that we do not lose or start all over again, like having to start from scratch to identify which species or which variety is for what. So they have the knowledge of the uses of what species is for medicine, and then also conservation. Conservation is very important for the species, the flora and fauna species and varieties, and how the application for sustainable development. They also have the knowledge of propagation and preservation, how you store the seeds and keep them viable so that in future you are able to use them again. How you can, that allows us to respond to crises, even to droughts, through preservation of our species without destroying them. Then threats. There's a very serious threat from multinational corporations which put profit over people and the planet. They pursue profit, they are prepared to destroy everything to earn profit. They don't have a conscience to preserve the planet. They don't have a conscience to preserve people. So that one is a major threat. They grab land, they promote industrial seeds. And then, about standing the test of time, indigenous knowledge and practices and methods endure forever. It is because they are genuine. It's because they are simple. In their being genuine and in their simplicity lies their ability to withstand the onslaught of corporations. That's why the islands of indigenous knowledge, of indigenous peoples, who we can fall back on to, knowing that the knowledge they preserve, the secrets they have, are going to be answers to the crises of our time. Not just climate change, but climate change has spin-off crises, for instance, of zoonotic diseases Like the recent COVID-19, people have attributed it, have said it has, scientists have said, they have traced its origin in animals. It crossed the species a gap from animals to human beings, so it's a zoonotic disease. And responses, many people, the research is still going on, have traced them back to biodiversity. For instance, in Uganda, if I can give an example, a response which is still being researched, but which tested positive for a lot of people, was Wabugia ugandensis. It's a plant, it's a tree. In fact, now it's under threat, but we are trying to reestablish it. We have put up a drive to plant it. It was used to treat, the symptoms of the COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude. That was really, really very inspiring. And also, thank you for showing us what are the major threats that a lot of Indigenous people and local communities face today across. And I think a lot of people who are here are listening and will be listening later on will find some kind of resonance in the various practices, I think, in some ways. So I think we've already also started getting questions, but something that we would want to talk about is about the future generations of the indigenous people and local communities. So how do these transfers of knowledge systems to how do we ensure there is a transfer, there is some sense of um, preservation, conservation of these knowledge systems while also taking into account the changing needs and aspirations of younger generations. So, what is the younger generation? What do the younger generation feel and with the various threats and challenges that both of you mentioned, how are we going ahead to ensure that this gets passed on and it continues? These knowledge systems that are very important also gets continued in the future generations. So, Pragya.
Yeah, hi Shruti. So yes, it's a very important question that is always under discussion also at Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact. Um, so what we're doing at AIPP is we're trying to build the capacity of Indigenous youth in Asia through leadership schools, etc., youth camps, um, supporting them with small grants to implement their grant, etc. So youth, as in any other social movements, are the change agents. So they need to be actively engaged and involved in all this process. There are very good examples of how Indigenous youth have contributed to a larger Indigenous peoples movement. For example, in Cambodia, the youth have taken the lead and strongly advocated against large development projects in their country. And also in Nepal, we can see Indigenous youth actively being engaged in the processes, etc. So, but I would like to also say that it's not only youth. The whole development should take into consideration and also include all the other intersectional groups that lies within the indigenous communities. So we need to listen to them, we need to include them and engage them. And there's also we need to be very innovative as well. I think it was last year where AIPP started a comic book series because we didn't want to come up with the books that nobody reads. So we wanted to target the youth. Therefore, we came up with the comic series. We are now doing the podcasts as well because most of the indigenous youth are on social media, and we want to also attract the youth in the movement. So we being innovative, listening to them, engaging them is how we could transmit the knowledge to the indigenous youth and also keep them engaged. Thanks, Shruti.
Thank you, Pragya. These are some of the things that are very, very important and have been going around. A lot of people have been talking about this, and I'm so glad that you've also shared examples, because it's no longer something that is like talked about in the ideas, but is actually being implemented. Um, Gertrude, so same question for you as well. How are we including youth while also taking into account the changing needs and aspiration? How are we ensuring that these knowledge systems are passed on from one generation to another, especially in these changing times?
Hi.
Gertrude?
Yes, hi all.
Michelle,
Yes,
Thank
uh,
you.
could we take the question? We will be taking question answers after this session is done. So if you could wait, or could you put your question in the chat box if that is possible for you? Yeah, thank you. Gertrude, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, this transferring the knowledge from the indigenous traditional people, traditional women, indigenous women, to the youths. The youths, we must recognize that the youths are faced with new challenges. They are attracted to TV, they're attracted to, there's a lot of, onslaught, should I call it onslaught, from all these, media, social media, electronic media, fashion industry, and they are also human. They are also being seeing these things because they are promoted very aggressively, and they are attracted to these things. But we should embed our strategy for transfer within how we try to protect from the threats. For instance, when we are protecting indigenous knowledge systems from threats, we could be going about using the rights-based approach, like enhancing participation. While we're enhancing participation, we should include the youth. While we are doing accountability, we should include the youth and also our governments or states, because we also exist within governments and states. They are required to protect the indigenous peoples from corporations, to respect the rights of indigenous peoples to enjoy their territories. The young people should not feel threatened or like it's a sin to be using indigenous methods, and also to recognize indigenous knowledge, because indigenous women's knowledge systems are the bedrock of global, regional, and national conservation policies. Indigenous women are usually the target of research as respondents. Their knowledge informs research findings, although they are not credited. It is a kind of plagiarism because it should be treated, indigenous women's knowledge should be treated as intellectual property. The knowledge should be patented and recognized as intellectual property rights for indigenous women, and that means the women will earn from it. The indigenous youth will be proud to identify with it when the women the indigenous women are credited with such, for instance, like the treatment for COVID-19, if it's attributed to an indigenous woman, and this indigenous woman is recognized at the UN, the youth will not feel ashamed of being indigenous, because right now the promotion, the media focus is to negate the indigenous way of living. You know, like when colonialism was taking place, whenever they came, they would say, your God is the devil. Your God is a devil. And all your Christian names, all your names are devilish names. You should adopt, you know, English names, for instance, for us who are colonized by England, to know that we are righteous. I mean, we are all human. Who knows who is righteous, who is not? The names they are giving me, they have a meaning in my own language. I should use my own language, for instance. So what I'm saying, there should be an effort to make indigenous knowledge attractive, to make the indigenous women proud of owning this knowledge, so that the young people can see it and be happy to identify with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gertrude. That was really powerful, and these are things that is a way ahead for all of us. And of course, with the threats of appropriation of knowledge systems, the way conservation policies exist today, which is so exclusionary, um, what are we looking so this is the last question for both of you. So what is the way ahead, especially in terms of looking at addressing uh, conservation and preservation of knowledge systems and transmission of knowledge systems and recognition of knowledge systems in global, regional, national, and policy in these policy spaces, especially considering Pragya, you've come and you've had work, and your organization's been working with extensively with the various international commitments. So has Gertrude. And what are the ways ahead that we could look at and that we could collectively come together to work towards that, especially in the context of preservation, conservation, and transmission of traditional knowledge systems for indigenous people and local communities. Pragya?
Yeah. So like we already discussed before as well, we have seen in the recent years a very gradual kind of increase to include indigenous women's knowledge systems in national, regional, and global level. I could give a very recent example, such as CEDAW General Recommendation 39 on Indigenous women and girls, and how the focus was on Indigenous women in other mechanisms, such as MRIB, expert mechanism on rights of Indigenous peoples, and Human Rights Council, etc. So this attention towards the importance of Indigenous women and traditional knowledge system um, needs to be accelerated, and it needs to be done fast. Because I'd also like to share my personal experience in the recent years while we have been trying to advocate for Indigenous women's meaningful representation, meaning beyond numbers in the different mechanisms. We're still being left behind. We're being left behind with the excuses that decision makers cannot arrange the interpretation for us, or the fund is not enough to cover more than one or two participants. The venues and the traveling expenses are very expensive for one Indigenous woman to represent in these mechanisms, right? So we had one exchange in May in Bangkok, where 14 Indigenous women across Asia gathered, and one of the key issue was how we're still being left behind and what we should do. So the ways that we could address and we could recognize and include the Indigenous women's knowledge um, in regional global context is to give space to Indigenous women to meaningfully represent their issues, build networks, amplify voices, and develop collective action. And as we've already mentioned, we need to include youth and we need to include the other intersectional groups within the Indigenous communities as well. Yeah, just to briefly respond to your question, Shruti, these are the major things I think needs to be done.
Thank you, Pragya. And over to you, Gertrude.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, well, I hope I'm still on, open. Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
We must make a deliberate effort to reach out to Indigenous women. The UN has done a tremendous job in identifying and documenting Indigenous peoples of the world. Oh, you are asking me to start my video? No. Can you hear me, please? Can you hear
Yes,
me?
yes, Gertrude. Yes, Gertrude, we can hear you.
Yeah,
Fine.
I'm saying that we must make a deliberate effort to reach out to Indigenous women. And I'm crediting the UN for having done a tremendous job in identifying and documenting Indigenous peoples of the world. They have been made into a constituency, and that is the first step. They've done this because it's the first step in stakeholder engagement. But again, the same UN is tending towards multi-stakeholder platforms rather than sovereign spaces. And what does this mean? This means that in their stakeholder engagement, they are not recognizing the power relations. If we don't distinguish between multi-stakeholder platforms and sovereign spaces, we won't realize that those other, when you bring corporations together with Indigenous peoples, corporations will bring their money, waving it in our face. We can fund the budget. We can, contribute this amount of money. Even your little Indigenous people can bring them in. But the person who has funded the budget will call the shots. You see, you will be bound, you will be duty bound to listen to them because they will have so much power over you that they will dictate terms in terms of who they will allocate tasks, they will assign responsibilities. Even the outcome, you will manipulate it to make it theirs. So what am I saying? We must resist that. An example is the recent Black Rock with the UN women. A letter was circulated that they were signing an agreement. And BlackRock is on record for having said and done some things that are anti-people. And then the president of AGRA was made president of the Food Systems Summit. That also worried us a lot. AGRA is not promoting, the systems that we agree with. We must resist this tendency. It does not matter how much money they have, how much of the budget they can cover. We must not worship money. We must push for the recognition of rights holders. And they must deal with us as rights holders. Thank you.
Thank you, Gertrude.
Yeah,
I
that's
think,
it for me.
thank you so much. I think before we move on to our Q&A session, I would request all of you to switch on the cameras so that, and before people start leaving, it'll be a good time for now to also see who has been listening in for all of us, and we take a quick picture also of the event. So Claire is going to do that. Good. People will switch on their cameras for 2 seconds. Claire, why don't you let us know when?
We want to spotlight the speakers just quickly so that we have a picture with them. I'll just spotlight the speakers. Yeah. Oh, I need to add the spotlight so that we can add spotlight. There. Okay. 1, 2, 3. May I add you, Tina? I'll also take a there. 1, 2, 3. One more to be sure. There's a backup. 1, 2, 3. And then for everyone. One more picture for everyone. There. 1, 2, 3. There. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. So we can jump into the Q&A session. I believe Michelle had unmuted herself, so maybe I can give it to her for the Q&A. Michelle, over to you. And if you could introduce yourself, where do you work, and who do you want the question to be addressed to before you start with the question? So, Michelle?
Yes, thanks a lot for this wonderful session on these special days for Indigenous peoples. I'm Michelle from Right and Resource Initiative. We are a coalition of more than 100 organizations in different parts of the world, trying to support Indigenous people, communities, right, including women, youth in these different groups. I think I have most a comment related to how can we do to preserve knowledge of Indigenous people for future generation. And this, I think we need to all agree on that. We need documentations. Why? Because for the future, you cannot conserve something now without documentation. In this case, we will lose our cultures. So that is the one point. We need documentation which is based on research. Secondly, we need to stop acculturation of traditional society. Why? Because you cannot say, okay, let's preserve and we want to cancel the way how people are doing things from more than 1 century. So we need to stop acculturation of traditional society, promote them, support them. And another way, I think we also need to support community-led conservations, because we need to stop forest conservation we have been done for so long, especially in case of Africa, where people was deprived on their traditional land. On their traditional land, we need to really support community-led conservation on their territory of life. And last but not the least, I think we need also to recognize the collective tenure, land tenure systems of traditional society, because their way of life, how they are preserved, their culture depend on the right they have on their land. If they lose these types of land tenure systems, we will lose anything. So thank you so much. Thank you for very learning sessions. It was very good. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. for your comments. Those are indeed very important to keep in mind. Are there any questions or for the speakers or the panelists? We did have a question for Pragya. This was from someone who left the meet. Oh, Devi is there? Or sorry, not Devi. I think just 2 seconds. Yes, I think this was Devi who had asked this question, which is, could you please share how Igbo Nori struggles, survive, or what Igbo Nori is doing to get respect from the other man? I'm sorry if I got the question right. So this is Devi from JKPP. So Pragya?
Yes, Devi, I have also shared the story link with you. Maybe you can have a bit more idea on how is it with Noiri, and maybe I can share with you later on Noiri's story that we have published on our own life as well. Of course, Noiri has struggled a lot to be where she is, but she has also worked a lot to prove that she is a very efficient and capable leader of the village. She has done a lot starting this women's forest. She has also started this women's, it's called female waterhead or something. So it's very sacred and it's worshipped, and that's where the water is being used for drinking to the whole village. So she has started so many of these initiatives, and she has also mobilized a lot of indigenous women for income generation using this natural cloth dyeing and a lot of things. And but we need to also consider that the Karens are matrilineal families. So the women there are in a much better position than the other non-matrilineal societies. So I think that's where her source of, inspiration also comes from. She has won so many awards for doing wonderful things. But that does not necessarily mean she did not face any resistance or challenges. So maybe I'll share with you her story later on through Shruti.
Yes, thank you. So all of this is going to be put up in our Women for Biodiversity website, and all possible links that Pragya and Gertrude and Hani's video link will all be put up so that everyone can have access to it and can read more about this. So Pragya, we can have all the other links also included in this. So what is being shared here? I think if there are no questions, we would come to the end of this session. We want to end it with another video, which is being shared by one of the partners of Women for Biodiversity, who they're from the Solomon Islands. And I would also like to use this opportunity to thank all the speakers and all the panelists who are here today, who took their time out and shared such valuable insights, such powerful messages on the day of the world's indigenous peoples. And especially on the topic of recognition of traditional knowledge, women's traditional knowledge, and as Christina rightfully said, to not be looked in silos, but in a more holistic sense. And I think it was very beautifully brought out in today's session. Thank you, Pragya. Thank you, Gertrude, for giving us your time and valuable time and sharing with us these lovely stories, these very, very powerful stories of resilience, inspiration, of things that we would want to use to kind of inform and kind of for the generations to come, future generations also to come. Thank you so much. And with that, we also would like to share a feedback survey that Claire is going to put in the chat box. So while we watch the video, please do share your feedback with us and what other topics we could focus on and what other things we could do as and what you felt about this webinar. So could we have the video now?
Osim, as a woman, we follow Iraya. We follow all the streams from we follow where have important tools from we follow because we forgot them all the fish, cells, even all the crabs or any kind of something is all the small streams from we follow. And then important too much too for me follow garem all the clean waters because every water blow me fala him come through lot of forest. Me like for talem nation for other big man blow me fala and other government blow me fala and also lo nation now lo whole world na that me fala also got roles inside lo other communities blow me fala other mamis and me fala other women na me fagar staka waka inside lo community where inside lo families we forgot about the duties, we forgot about the roles or sense. So we feel like whole world or people or the big man or the recognizing me fala that me fala also important set of the community.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all the participants who joined us and who were there throughout the session. We look forward to more of such sessions in the future, and thank you all. And have a great day.